Teaching today that is dear to my heart, and I've teased you over the weeks about the fourth gospel, and that John didn't really write the fourth gospel, so I keep referring to it as the fourth gospel. Today we're going to find out who is the disciple whom Yahusha loved. Who really wrote the book of John? Would you believe tradition or the Bible? If there were definitive proof from the scriptures that a certain other disciple wrote the fourth gospel, the one that we call the book of John, would you believe the tradition that John wrote it, or would you believe what the Bible clearly has to say? And I think the answer that I'm prompting you to give is pretty obvious. Of course, we're going to believe the scriptures, right? Because tradition has customarily been unreliable and often leads us down paths that cause us to go astray from the straight word that Father gives us in the scriptures. And so, to let you know, there is nothing in the fourth gospel that says John wrote that gospel. Okay, it just isn't there. It's non-existent. But tradition tells us, somebody started a tradition in the early centuries, and I can't even pinpoint the exact time when this occurred, that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the fourth gospel. And so we've always attributed the fourth gospel to John. We call it the book of John. We refer to John as the beloved disciple because this gospel says that the disciple whom Yahusha loved wrote this gospel. And so following that tradition, we think of John as the beloved disciple, and he's referred to that way and so forth. Your Bible says that the fourth gospel was written by John. Okay, and what I mean by that is in your notes, the heading of the book says the gospel according to John. Okay, and so the Bible that we all have usually tells us that this was written by John. Can we trust the record of Scripture? Yes, we can trust the record of Scripture, but we have to distinguish between what the Scripture says, what was written, and the notes and the so-called helps that the editors and the translators of our Bibles have given us to try to give us hints about, this section of Scripture, or this is about such and such, and there's little headers all throughout the Scriptures telling us what we're about to read. And yet those things aren't necessarily reliable because that was somebody's interpretation. And the fact of the authorship of the fourth gospel is in dispute because there's a tradition, and then there's now what we're going to look at today, the record of Scripture, the testimony of the writer of the fourth gospel as to who this beloved disciple is. So we need to know what part of the Bible is the actual scriptures, what is edited, what is formatted, title, text, footnotes, commentary, chapter and verse divisions, section headings, and translations. All of those things are man-made additions, not the translations necessarily, but even the translations are according to what somebody or some group of scholars or whatever think the scriptures mean, and so they translate according to what they understand is being said, not necessarily reliable, as are the titles, text, footnotes, the commentary, and all the divisions that are typically found in our English Bibles. So here's the verse. In the fourth gospel, chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, tells us who wrote this gospel. It says, Kepha, or Peter, turned and saw that disciple whom Yahusha loved was following them. And this was the one who had leaned back against Yahusha at the supper and had said, Master, who is going to betray you? At that portion of Scripture, it only identifies this disciple as the one whom Yahusha loved. It doesn't tell us that it was John or anyone else. It's the disciple Yahusha loved. And when Kepha saw him, he asked, Master, what about him? And Yahusha answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. And because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers and that this disciple would not die. But Yahusha did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. And so here, at the very end of this gospel, we're told that this disciple that has been spoken of throughout the last 5 or 6 chapters of the 4th gospel is the one who wrote down this account of the life and ministry of the Messiah Yahusha. So who is he? Do we base our faith on Bible or tradition? What does the Bible say? Would you believe the Bible over tradition if the Bible clearly says that someone other than John wrote the 4th gospel? How clear must it be that somebody else, some named individual, actually wrote this 4th gospel? Does the writer identify himself by name? How much evidence from Scripture would it take to change your mind about the authorship of the 4th gospel? Most people don't really want the truth, and this is not an indictment on anyone here. It's about what we find out there in the world of religion. Most people don't really want the truth. They just want constant reassurance that what they believe is the truth. Because that's what, if you present something that they haven't heard before as truth, and you quote the scriptures and you give them scriptural evidence, they'll say, but this is what I believe. So I don't believe what you're telling me. This is what I believe. And this is what people rely on. They rely upon their own belief in something, whether it's true or false, whether they can validate what they believe as truth or not. They just want to continue to believe what they believe and what they're used to, how they've lived their life. So do you want the truth, or do you want reassurance that what you were told is truth? How do you get your reassurance that what you believe is the truth? The scriptures say this: prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. And then Paul to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So we need to diligently work at finding out what truth is. It's not something that we can rely on as somebody hands us a platter of information. We need to diligently search the scriptures for ourselves. And the Bereans were a named group of believers that did this very thing. It says in Acts 17:11, the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures to see if what Paul said was true. And so that's what we all need to do, is we need to examine the scriptures. So I want to look at this lesson about love, because love is at the root of identifying who this disciple is that wrote the 4th gospel. It was the disciple whom Yahusha loved. And so in the 4th gospel, chapter 21, verses 1 through 2, it says, afterward, Yahusha appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way: Shimon Kepha, that's Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the son of Zebedee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. So again, here's an unnamed 2 disciples in this case. In other places, it refers to a disciple or another disciple or that disciple. And that disciple is left in those places where that designation is used, unnamed. So we're left to try to figure out who that disciple is that keeps popping up all throughout the gospel, the 4th gospel. And therefore, it is necessary in Acts chapter 1, when they were choosing a replacement for Judas, it is necessary to choose one of the men who have been with us the whole time the Master Yahusha went in and out among us, beginning from Yochanan's baptism to the time when Yahusha was taken up from us. And for one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. So they proposed 2 men, Joseph called Barsabbas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. What's interesting about this is that there were other disciples who were with Yahusha all throughout his ministry that are unnamed in the gospel accounts. These two people we'd never heard of before, Joseph and Matthias, and yet these were chosen because they had been with, in following the ministry from John's baptism all the way through the life and ministry and death and then a resurrection and ascension of the Messiah. So there were other people that were unnamed, and there were those that were named, that were known and more well-known of the disciples. In the fourth gospel, chapter 21, we read this account, and it refers again to the writer of this fourth gospel. Shimon Kepha said, "I am going out to fish," and they said, "We'll go with you." And so they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And early in the morning, Yahusha stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Yahusha. He called out to them, "Friends, have you any fish?" "No," they answered. And he said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Yahusha loved, there he is, unnamed, but known because he was loved by Yahusha, he said to Kepha, "It is the Master." And as soon as Shimon Kepha heard him say, "It is the Master," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. So this disciple was hanging out with the other apostles. The ones that were named were Shimon Kepha and I think the sons of Zebedee. But this disciple was also there with him. And so he had input into this conversation. It says, "And when they had finished eating, Yahusha said to Shimon Kepha," Simon Peter, "Shimon, son of Yochanan, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Master," he said, "you know that I love you." And Yahusha said, "Feed my lambs." And again Yahusha said, "Shimon, son of Yochanan, do you truly love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Master, you know that I love you." And Yahusha said, "Take care of my sheep." And the third time he said to him, "Shimon, son of Yochanan, do you love me?" And Kepha was hurt because Yahusha asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Master, you know all things. You know that I love you." And the Master replied, "Feed my sheep." So it's important to understand the betrayals, the denials of Simon Peter. He denied him 3 times. And this is the Master restoring Simon Peter because he asked him 3 times. And that's why Simon was hurt. That the third time that the Master asked him, do you love me? And so the Master restored Peter because he gave him the opportunity to overturn those denials and to confess his love for the Master. So this brings us into a quick little Greek word study of these two words that are usually translated love. You're familiar with the word agape. We hear it all the time, in the sermons and in the teachings in the Christian churches and in the Messianic world and all the rest. It comes from the word agapao. You won't see this form agapao in the New Testament because this is a form of the word that is presented as kind of like the root word. You will see agapa and other endings on the agap part of the word. The o at the end is just a way of presenting the verb to the one who's studying. Okay, so agapao is the verb. And it's usually translated love, especially, and here's where we're getting into what I mentioned earlier about love of the intellect and love of the emotions. Agapao is a love based on evaluation and choice. It's a matter of will and action. It's the love that is of the intellect and of the mind. It's often used with reference to people to love or to be loyal to or to highly regard. It's a word that's used in reference to Elohim himself, and even toward other things. It suggests value to delight in and to strive for or to long for. And so agape love is a love of the mind. It's a love of the intellect. And Elohim certainly has this love for his people. He has agape love. And we read much about the agape love that he has for us and that we're encouraged to have for one another. The other word, phile, it's presented as phileo, with that O ending, because that's the way the verb is presented by scholars, by teachers of Greek. This is a love as devotion based in the emotions. It could be translated like, or to feel affection for, and with the accusative of person. That's a little technical thing we don't need to get into, but as an outward expression of affection. And a form of this word is even used in the word translated kiss. It's followed by an infinitive. When it's followed by an infinitive, it means to like to or to be accustomed to do something. So the important thing to note here is that phileo love is typically a love of the emotions. And what you may have heard in messages and sermons and teachings is that agape love is a God love, and phileo love is a human love. And I object to that way of expressing this because I don't think it's accurate. Agape love is a love of the intellect, of the mind. It certainly is the kind of love that Elohim shows, but it's also a love that we show one another. And even that kind of love can be shown in a very negative sense. And we're going to look at a couple of verses where agape is not the love of the Father, but it's the love of rebellious people for sin. And so the word agape is also used of loving sin. And so phileo love is a love of the emotions. It's not just a human love. It's also a love that Elohim expresses toward his people. And we need to understand that that's where we get our emotional love for one another, as well as our intellectual love for one another, because it all comes from Elohim. It's all a part of the character that he has stamped into human beings as part of his nature. Okay, so the use of agape love. In the fourth gospel, chapter 17, verse 24, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of agape love and a couple of examples of phileo love to show you that agape love is not exclusively God love, and phileo love is not exclusively human love. But in fact, in some cases, those two words can be synonymous and can be used interchangeably. So here we go, fourth gospel, chapter 17. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory, the glory you have given me because you loved me before the creation of the world. Word agape is there. In Ephesians 2, verses 4 and 5, because of his great love, agape love, for us, Elohim, who is rich in mercy, made us alive. And so in these instances, agape love is describing the love of the Father for his Son and for us, his people. Now, agape love is also used of the love that wicked people have for wickedness. And here's three examples of it. In 2 Timothy 4:10, it says, for Demas, because he loved this world, and that's agape. He loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. So here's a deserter of the faith who is loving the world. And again, it's an intellectual, it's a love of the mind. He had set his mind and his heart to love the world, and so he left following the Messiah. The second example, 1 John 2:15, do not love the world or anything in the world. That's agape, don't love it. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Okay? So the agape love can refer to loving the world and the things of the world. And then finally, 2 Peter 2:15, they have left, speaking of the false prophets, they have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. And that's the word agape again. That's not God's love, loving wickedness. That's the love of human beings who have fallen from Elohim. And again, the word agape is used in that instance. So let's take a quick look at phileo love. Yahusha answered them, this is in the 5th chapter of the 4th Gospel. Yahusha gave them this answer, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also, for the Father loves the Son. That's phileo. You would expect, if you didn't know that, you would expect that that would have been the word agape. But it's the word phileo love. The Father phileo loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, to your amazement, he will show him even greater things than these. And then in chapter 16 of the 4th Gospel, it says, no, the Father himself loves you, that's phileo love, because you have loved me, that's phileo love, and have believed that I came from the Father. So there's an emotional aspect to the love of the Father for us, and there's an emotional aspect of our love for one another and our love for him. And that's what's expressed by this Greek word phileo. Those whom I love, in Revelation 3:19, phileo. This is in the message to one of the 7 churches that were addressed in this case in chapter 3. Those whom I love, phileo love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent. Again, if you didn't know the Greek word was phileo there, by what we've all been taught, we would have thought that would be the word agape, because isn't agape word love, isn't that from Elohim? And yet the distinctions are different than what we've been taught. It's not about God love and human love. It's about the love in the mind of the intellect and the love of emotions. And Elohim has both of those kinds of love, and we have both of those kinds of love. So the word phileo is used 25 times in the New Testament. Paul only uses it 2 times. The 4th Gospel uses this term 13 times. By far the most used by any writer of the New Testament. And that's where this is important for the study that we're doing today. Who is the disciple whom Yahushua loved? Matthew, Mark, and Luke all together use it 8 times, and the book of Revelation uses it twice. And so here, the 4th Gospel uses this word more than all of the other uses in the rest of the New Testament, and that's why, it's important. By contrast, agapao, the agape love, is employed or used 143 times in the New Testament, far more often than the word phileo love. But clearly, agapao is the preferred, a more common word for love, and the writer of the 4th Gospel uses both terms almost equally, equal number of times, and interchangeably. So we're going to see agape and phileo used interchangeably in the 4th Gospel, and also in identifying who this disciple is whom Yahushua loved, because sometimes that word love is agape, and sometimes it uses the word phileo when it refers to the disciple whom Yahushua loved. So here we go. When they were finished eating, Yahusha said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you truly love me more than these? And here the word is agape love. And yes, Master, Simon Peter said, you know that I phileo love you. And Yahushua said, feed my lambs. So people, when they teach this lesson about Simon Peter's 3 affirmations of his love, they teach that the Master is saying to you, God love me, do you agape love me? And he says, oh, I phileo love you. But that's not what Peter's really saying. It's at the discretion of the writer, and in fact the translator of this 4th Gospel, who translated it into Greek, I believe, that these words are used interchangeably. Because we know that by the 3rd reaffirmation, Simon Peter wasn't upset because the Master, and in fact, let me just jump to that slide. And the 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of Yochanan, do you phileo love me? And he said, Simon Peter was hurt because Yahusha asked him the 3rd time, do you phileo love me? And he said, Master, you know all things. You know that I phileo love you. And Yahusha said, feed my sheep. And so people, sometimes preachers are led to teach this as the master lowered the standard of love the third time so that Peter could affirm his emotional love for the master. And yet that's not really the point of what was said here. The point is that he was upset because he asked him the third time. He realized that the master was confronting those denials and giving him an opportunity to be restored. It wasn't because he used the word phileo or agape or whatever, because in fact they didn't even speak Greek to one another. When this account occurred, they were speaking Hebrew. And so this distinction between agape and phileo wouldn't even have been a part of the conversation. But the Greek translator translated using these two words interchangeably, as he did throughout the fourth gospel. And we're going to look at a couple other instances of that as well. So that's what this slide was. I just explained this slide. So here are, because now we understand the distinction between these two Greek words, agapao and phileo, I'm going to show you the 5 instances where the disciple whom Yahusha loved is mentioned. It's in chapter 13, verse 23, at the dinner, and the disciple whom Yahusha loved was there at the dinner and leaned upon the master's breast. And here the word loved is agapao. It's the disciple whom Yahusha agapao loved. And then beneath the cross, in chapter 19, verse 26, the disciple whom he loved, again, the word agapao, this disciple was standing nearby, next to his mother. In chapter 20, in verse 2, this disciple and Peter were racing to the tomb, and the other disciple, the one that Yahushua loved, and here the word is phileo. So you can see that the word is used interchangeably here. He's the one that Yahushua phileo loved. And then while fishing, we already read this account, and at the end of chapter 21, the telling of their futures, again, the word employed is agapao, love, the disciple whom Yahushua agapao loved. So the point here is that these words are used interchangeably. Let me move on to another section, because this will set up actually finding out who this disciple is. I want to show you and raise some suspicion and even some doubt that John could have written this gospel. There's a ton of evidence. It's circumstantial evidence. It's not proof beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it raises some important questions about if John wrote this fourth gospel, why this and why that? Why was it written in the way it was written? So consider the following evidence that it wasn't Yochanan and John that wrote the fourth gospel. It's clear that the fourth gospel is an eyewitness testimony. It says, I tell you the truth, the master said, we speak what we know and we testify to what we have seen. But still you people do not accept our testimony. And that's a word about the testimony of people. And then again, this is the disciple at the end of chapter 21. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. So the writer was an eyewitness testimony to the things that were written in the gospel. Yochanan's signature on the book of Revelation, it's clear that the book of Revelation was written by John because he names himself 4 times as the writer of the book of Revelation. The revelation of Yahushua Messiah, which Elohim gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant Yochanan, who testifies to everything he saw. That is the word of Elohim and the testimony of Yahushua Messiah. Again, in Revelation 1:4, Yochanan to the 7 assemblies in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you. And then dropping down into Revelation 1:9, I, Yochanan, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Yahusha, was on the Isle of Patmos because of the word of Elohim and the testimony of Yahusha. And yet one more time, at the end of the book of Revelation, he identifies himself for a 4th time. I, Yochanan, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I had heard and seen them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who had been showing them to me. And so John, it's very clear that Yochanan John wrote the book of Revelation because he names himself 4 times as the writer, the one who testified, the one who wrote these things down. But the 4th gospel is not identified as being written by John in the manner that John did so in the book of Revelation. If John wrote the 4th gospel, you would have expected him to have named himself as the writer. And yet the writer kind of in a mysterious way identifies himself. And we're going to find out that it wasn't all that mysterious at all because he had named himself. Hallelujah. The first 3 Gospels all mention these 3 notable events in the Messiah's ministry where John was only one of 3 witnesses. The raising of the daughter of Jairus, and there's some references there that refer to this raising and that John was there. His transfiguration, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this as well. His Gethsemane prayers, John was there, as testified by these 3 references, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And only 3 disciples were present at these events, and the Apostle John was one of them. Although John was an eyewitness to all of these events, there is no mention of these key events in the gospel that today bears John's name. Why, if John were writing an eyewitness account of the ministry of Messiah, why didn't he name and talk about all of those events where he was in fact an eyewitness? These are 3 of those places. These are 3 of those events that he was clearly only one of 3 eyewitnesses, and yet he doesn't. Those things aren't included in the 4th gospel. So why wouldn't he have written about those things? While Yahusha was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" And ignoring what they said, Yahusha told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except for Kepha, that's Peter, Yaakov, James, and Yochanan, the brother of Yaakov. And so there's the testimony that Yochanan was an eyewitness of this raising of the daughter of Jairus. And here's the reference to how he was also an eyewitness of the transfiguration event. It says that after 6 days, Yahusha took with him Kepha, Yaakov, and Yochanan. These are the same 3 that we call them the inner circle of the disciples, right? And so Yochanan was an eyewitness of the transfiguration also. But we don't find that account in the 4th gospel. And then the Gethsemane prayers. He took Kepha and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And so here again, John was an eyewitness of the Gethsemane prayers, and yet we don't see that mentioned in the 4th gospel. Why is it? It's very curious to me. Why wouldn't he have testified to these things that he was a known eyewitness to, and given maybe greater detail or his thoughts or whatever, his side of the story, but it doesn't occur in the 4th gospel. Here are other events where John was an eyewitness. And Yahusha, in Luke chapter 9, Yahusha told John, "Ye know not what manner of spirit you are of," when rebuking John and his brother after they sought to command fire to come down from heaven. And so why doesn't John mention this event? And it doesn't occur in the 4th gospel. John, in Luke chapter 22, John and Peter were sent by Yahusha to prepare the accommodations for the Passover. Why doesn't John mention that in the 4th gospel if he was the writer, he was the eyewitness? He would have had helpful details that non-eyewitnesses wouldn't have had. The mother of John and his brother asked Yahusha to seat them, one on the right hand and the other on the left hand, in thy glory. Yahusha privately answered this question about when they were on the Mount of Olives later on. These 3 disciples, these 4, John, Peter, James, and Andrew, were asking him about the Temple Mount and so forth, and describing the beauty. And that's where he goes into the Olivet Discourse, where he describes the future of Jerusalem, and all the way up the prophecy, all the way up to the time of his coming. And yet, in the 4th gospel, we don't see this account given. It raises great suspicion in my mind that John could have written the fourth gospel. It turns out that every event where John is referred to by name in the first three gospels is missing from the fourth gospel. We know many things about John. We know his name. He was the son of Zebedee. He had a brother named James. He was a fisherman. He and his brothers were partners with Peter and were present when Yahusha healed Peter's wife's mother. John was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Yahusha. His mother asked for John and his brother for the seats next to Yahusha in his kingdom. They were surnamed by Yahusha Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. He and his brother once wanted to call down fire from heaven on a group of people, and Yahusha rebuked them for it. John was the one who told Yahusha, "We saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him." And none of these facts is told in the fourth gospel. Why wouldn't John have said more about who he is and what he saw and said if he was in fact the writer of the fourth gospel? So I think we've raised enough suspicion and doubt as to John being the writer of the fourth gospel, even though tradition tells us that he did. And this is the conflict between tradition and what we can read from the actual word. In the fourth gospel, we're informed that Peter and another disciple ran to the tomb, and that this other disciple, the one whom Yahusha loved, got there first. When Peter arrived, he went into the tomb and saw the grave closed. And finally, the other disciple, whoever this other disciple is, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. This is an important testimony. This disciple saw the grave closed and believed. The text doesn't say that Peter believed, but the other disciple, the one who is the author of this fourth gospel, saw and believed. And yet, after that event, Yahusha appeared to the 11 and rebuked them for not believing when the women told him that he was raised. So it necessarily excludes John from being that other disciple, because the other disciple saw and believed, but John and all of the 11 did not believe until the Messiah appeared for himself and showed them that he was alive. They were rebuked. Okay, and that was the Mark 16:14. He appeared, and he rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he was risen. The disciple whom Yahushua loved was known by the high priest. Shimon Kepha, and this is in the fourth gospel, chapter 18, when he was brought to trial. Shimon Kepha and another disciple, there he is again, another unnamed disciple, were following the Master Yahusha. And because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Yahusha into the high priest's courtyard, but Kepha had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Kepha in. So this disciple whom Yahusha loved was known by the high priest. But John is clearly indicated in the book of Acts, he was not known by the high priest. It says in Acts 4, 5, and 6, Annas the high priest was there, and so were Caiaphas, Elkanah, Alexander, and the other men of the high priest's family. This was, it was when John and Peter were brought before the high priests and this Sanhedrin assembly. When they saw the courage of Kepha and Yochanan and realized that they were unschooled ordinary men, they were astonished when they came to understand that these men had been with Yahusha. They were astonished. John was not known by the high priest, but the high priest came to understand that he had been with Yahusha, and he was astonished by it. If John was that disciple that was known to the high priest wouldn't have been surprised here. The preponderance of evidence strongly suggests that John did not write the fourth gospel. Much of this is circumstantial evidence, the naming of the fourth gospel as being according to John. But don't forget about the absence of John's eyewitness accounts in the fourth gospel. So, then, let's get on with it. Who then wrote the book of John? Of John. What do we know about the disciple whom Yahushua loved? Again, just repeating, he reclined with Yahusha at the supper. He was at the cross. He was the first man at Yahusha's tomb and the first to believe. He had gone fishing and was the first to identify Yahusha when he was out in the boat. And he was named as the author, the writer of this gospel. Those are the 5 statements made about this disciple whom Yahusha loved. He's at the supper Yahusha had with his disciples just before his betrayal. Yahusha had just washed his disciples' feet and was revealing to them that one of them was going to betray him. His disciples stared at one another at a loss of which of them he meant, and one of them, the disciple whom Yahusha loved, was reclining against the chest or the breast of Yahusha, and Shimon Kepha motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against the chest of Yahusha, he asked him, Master, who is it? So the writer of this gospel was the one who was right next to Yahusha and leaning against his breast at this special supper that was made in honor of him. And near the cross, we've already talked about this, the disciple of whom he loved was standing nearby and said, and Yahusha said, as Yahusha was hanging on the tree, he said to his mother, here is your son. And to that disciple he said, here is your mother. And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. And so because of the tradition, we think that John took Miriam, the mother of the Messiah, into his home. But it doesn't really say that, does it? It just says this disciple whom Yahusha loved. And this other disciple, here it is again. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Miriam Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And so she came running to Shimon Kepha and the other disciple, the one Yahusha loved, and said, they have taken the master out of the tomb. We don't know where they have put him. And so Kepha and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Kepha. And so this we know about this other disciple. He reached the tomb first, and he was the first to believe. Where is this one? In chapter 21. We've already read this. I'm going to skip these two because we've already talked about the fishing, when they went fishing and didn't catch anything at night. And that other disciple was the one who recognized that it was Yahusha standing out in the boat. And it was the other disciple that Kepha was asking the master, what about him? What's going to happen to him? And Yahusha said, if I want him to remain alive until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. And so everyone thought at that point that this other disciple, the one that Yahusha loved, was going to live forever. And there's that account in chapter 21. So by designation of the other disciple, I've shown you the 5 places where it says, it references the disciple whom Yahusha loved. But there are 5 other places in the 4th gospel where this individual is described as the other disciple, another disciple, the disciple, or that disciple. And it's referring to this same individual. It's the one that Yahusha loved. Here are the 5 places in chapter 1, 18, 19, 20, and 21. Shimon Kepha, those are the references. I'm going to skip that because we already read that. Who is the disciple that Yahusha loved? Is he identified by name in the 4th gospel? And I'm going to tell you, yes, he is. How many people are identified in the 4 gospels as being loved by Yahusha? And you can use a concordance or whatever, and you can look this up and find out how many times in the 4 gospels they mention that Yahusha, the master, Messiah, loved some particular individual. There's only 2 places where it says that in all 4 gospels. In the first 3 gospels, there is a man that is named where it says that the master loved him. And then in the 4th gospel, there's a man who's mentioned where it says that Yahusha loved him. And this is the individual who is being, this is the answer to our investigation. It's this man in the 4th gospel. And the one mentioned in the first 3 gospels, we're going to look at that and suggest that that might be this same individual. Because there are reasons to believe that the one that's mentioned in the first three Gospels is also the one whom is identified as the one that the Master loved in the fourth Gospel. The rich young ruler is the one that was mentioned in the first three Gospels, where it says that Yahusha loved this person. No one else in those three Gospels does it say that. As Yahusha started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "And why do you call me good?" Yahusha answered. "No one is good except Elohim alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." "Teacher," he declared, "all these I have kept since I was a boy." And Yahusha looked at him and loved him. "One thing you lack," he said. "Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me." And at this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. This man had great wealth. But Yahusha loved him. Note also that it says, "All of these commandments I have kept since I was a boy." This had to have been a Jew, somebody who was faithful. So we know these things about the rich young ruler, that he was wealthy, that he loved Yah, that he kept all the commandments. And that's righteousness, as our sister pointed out earlier. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us this account of the rich young ruler. Matthew tells us he was young and rich. Luke tells us he was a ruler and wealthy. If he was Jewish and he was a ruler, then he was almost certainly a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a ruler in Israel, a Jewish ruler in Israel. And Mark tells us he was rich and that Yahusha loved him. So could the rich young ruler be the same man as the one identified in the fourth Gospel? Well, we're going to look at this one identified in the fourth Gospel. Drum roll, please. We're finally there, and I'm gonna show you who this person is. Hallelujah, we arrived. All right, so the 11th chapter tells us about Lazarus. Woo! Now, a man named Lazarus, or Eleazar, is his Greek name, or excuse me, his Hebrew name. He was sick, and he was from Bethany, the village of Miriam and her sister Martha. This Miriam, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Master and wiped his feet with her hair. And so the sisters sent word to Yahusha saying, "Master, the one you love is sick." There it is. This is this disciple, the man whom Yahusha loved. And so the sisters testified to the Master's love for their brother Lazarus. By the way, the word Lazarus is a Greek form of the Hebrew name Eleazar or Eleazar, and it's a priestly name. The name Eleazar was passed down from generation to generation in the priestly family because one of Aaron's sons was named Eleazar, you remember. So Eleazar was always a priestly name, and it was given to sons born in the family of the priests. And so where it says that the rich young ruler was a ruler and he was Jewish, it suggests in connection with this that maybe Lazarus was that rich young ruler, because Lazarus had a priest's name. And he was rich, and he was also well known, or he was known by the high priest, and he had many Jewish friends who came to his funeral. Remember when Yahushua went to the grave, and all these Jews, Pharisees and Sadducees, all gathered because they knew Lazarus. He was one of their own. So Lazarus was the one identified here in verse 3 as the one whom the Master loved. But that's not all. That's only the beginning. His name, I mentioned this, his name comes from Latzar or Eleazar, which is the Hebrew name. And so verse 3 is where it identifies Lazarus as the one who is this disciple that Yahusha loved. But 2 verses later, we're told again that Yahusha loved Lazarus. When he heard this, verses 4 and 5, Yahusha said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for Elohim's glory, so that Elohim's Son may be glorified through it." And then it says, Yahusha loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So why did he say it again? Is Yahusha's love for Lazarus germane to the story? Well, it is, if he's the one telling the story of his own resurrection and why Yahusha provided that for him. He was a friend of the Master, and he was loved by the Master, and he was used really next to the Master's own resurrection. This was the ultimate event of the fourth gospel. This was the featured miracle mentioned in the fourth gospel. It was the raising of Lazarus, the friend, the one who was loved by Yahusha. And so here, the one who testifies to Yahusha's love for Lazarus is Lazarus himself. He's writing this. As the story unfolds, Yahusha tells his disciples that they are headed back to Yehuda, to the town of Bethany, to see their friend Lazarus. So here it is in verse 11 of chapter 11. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." Now let's look at the Greek word for translated friend here. It's the word philos. It's the same root word, phileo, that emotional love. And so a friend is literally one who is loved. So here for a third time in the chapter 11, Lazarus is described as being loved by Yahusha because he's his friend, loved one. This is the third time where this is mentioned, and yet there's one more time where this disciple is referred to as the one who is loved by the Master. In verses 33 to 35 it says, "When Yahusha saw her weeping, and the Yehudim, all the Jews who had come along with her, also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled." "Where have you laid him?" the Master asked. "Come and see, Master," they replied. Yahusha wept. Jesus wept, the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. But then look what it says in the next verse. "Then the Yehudim said, 'See how he loved him.'"
Amen.
A fourth witness to the fact that the Messiah loved this man, Lazarus. It's an amazing statement because it's brought on by the Jews who were witnessing all these things. All of those friends of Lazarus who had come, and they realized that Yahusha loved him. Some translations render this, "Behold how he loved him." But to paraphrase it, to really bring out an emphasis of it, what's being said here is something like this: stop and take notice how much Yahusha loved Lazarus. And so 4 times the disciple that Yahusha loved is identified here by name. It's Lazarus. He's the only one mentioned as being loved by the Master. There's more evidence. This is the 4th time. So how many times does the Torah require to establish a thing? How many witnesses? 2 or 3 witnesses? Well, we got 4. So there's plenty of witnesses as to who the disciple was whom Yahusha loved. So again, Mary and Martha testified that Yahusha loved Lazarus. The writer of the 4th gospel himself testified that Yahusha loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yahusha testified to the fact that he loved Lazarus by calling him his friend, his philos, his loved one. And then the Jews who were gathered there also testified that Yahusha loved this man Lazarus. These 4 witnesses legally established the fact that Yahusha loved Lazarus. Pretty simple. Now, when we move on after the resurrection of Lazarus into the 12th chapter, Lazarus is mentioned a couple more times. Now Lazarus is part of the group of disciples who are hanging out with Yahusha. So verses 1 and 2, chapter 11, 53 to 54 says, So from that day on, they plotted to take his life, the Jews who had witnessed this. Therefore, Yahusha no longer moved about publicly among the Yehudim. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. And 6 days before the Pesach, the Passover, Yahusha arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Yahusha had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Yahusha's honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. So now again, Lazarus is with the other disciples and accompanying the master wherever he goes. He's with him at this dinner. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Yehudim found out that Yahusha was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. And so the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Yehudim were going over to Yahusha and putting their faith in him. The fame of Lazarus on account of his being raised from the dead was becoming widespread. And now in verses 17 and 18, it says, the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. The final mention of Lazarus by name is in 12:17, what we just read, that he was the one that called Lazarus from the tomb. It's in 12:17 of the fourth gospel. Lazarus appears in chapter 11, where he is the subject, whom Yahusha raised from the dead, and the one who is emphatically named as the one whom Yahusha loved. His name is placed into the record of the fourth gospel a total of 13 times in chapters 11 and 12, and there are the verse references to where the name Lazarus occurs. And then, now this part's really interesting, pay attention. Then after chapter 12, Lazarus seems to disappear. Where did he go? What happened to him? Do you really think that Lazarus disappeared after the Messiah raised him from the dead?
No.
Not likely. You would think that such an event would have drawn him that much closer and nearer to the Master, where he wouldn't want to leave him for any reason. Lazarus recognized the authority that Yahusha had because he raised him from the dead. So Lazarus, who was emphatically identified as being loved by Yahusha, seems to disappear from the narrative after his fantastic resurrection is recorded in chapters 11 and 12, and he's not mentioned by name again. But then one who is designated by the title, the disciple whom Yahusha loved, mysteriously appears out of nowhere in chapter 13 and finds himself embedded into the narrative, actually places himself there, all the way to the end of the fourth gospel. Could this be the same person? The one who was identified as loved, and then the one who is referenced as the one who was loved by Yahusha, but his name not mentioned again. It's clear and it's obvious. There's no mistaking the fact that this disciple whom Yahusha loved is the very one and the same Lazarus whom Yahusha loved. And finally, the writer's last commentary is to identify himself with this disciple whom Yahusha loved. So Lazarus wrote the fourth gospel.
Amen.
And the evidence is irrefutable.
Amen.
If we set aside tradition and we just listen to what the word actually says and we look at the testimony of what's given, it's clear as day that Lazarus wrote the gospel. Is it possible, a couple more things, because I want to go over a couple of these events where it describes this disciple whom Yahushua loved, and you're going to see why it applies to Lazarus much more easily and recognizable as it would have if we believed that John wrote the gospel. So, is it possible that Lazarus was also present in the events recorded in the fourth gospel before the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11? Because there's this other disciple that's mentioned in chapter 1, verse 28. I don't know if I have a slide for that. In 1 verse 28, it says that there were two of John's disciples went, when John identified him as the Lamb of Elohim who takes away the sin of the world, these two disciples of John went to be with Yahusha, and one of them was Peter. It tells us that the one was Peter, but it never mentioned the name of the other disciple that was one of John's disciples, but went over to be a disciple of Yahusha. And I'm suggesting to you that of course it is, because this is the way Lazarus identified himself a number of times in this fourth gospel as that other disciple. And also because he was a known friend to Yahusha and the other disciples. So they knew who this person was, because presumably he had already been with them and he had walked with them, and at least part of the time. And so Lazarus seems to have been that disciple, that other disciple not named in chapter 1, who used to be John's disciple and then became Yahusha's disciple. It also says that John, in that account in chapter 1, John was baptizing at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. And we know that Lazarus lived in Bethany, but not the Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, but in the Bethany that was near Jerusalem. And so it seems that Lazarus mentioned this Bethany on the other side of the Jordan to try to make that distinction and that connection between the two different Bethanies, the Bethany where he lived and the Bethany where John, on the other side of the Jordan where John was baptizing. What about the great emphasis on the resurrection? Clearly, the emphasis in the book of the fourth gospel, I almost said the book of John, the book of Lazarus, let's call it what it is, the fourth gospel, the book of Lazarus. The resurrection was a featured event, both the resurrection of the Master at the end and the resurrection of Lazarus, which was the culminating miracle event that Messiah was showing himself to be who he is. And in chapter 11 happens to occur right in the very center of that book. So he gives a record of the accounts and the wonders and miracles that Messiah did, culminating in his own resurrection, and then moving on to the rest of the story of how Messiah was put to death and then also resurrected. So why would Lazarus, as the author of this book, be preoccupied with the topic of the resurrection? Well, it's obvious. We just said the reason that would be so. So the other events that mention the disciple of Yahushua, that Yahushua loved, are these, and they make more sense now that we've identified Lazarus as this disciple. He's at the supper Yahushua had with his disciples. Yahushua had just washed his disciples' feet and was revealing to them that one of them was going to betray him. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. And one of them, the disciple whom Yahushua loved, was reclining next to him. Shimon Kepha mentioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." And leaning back against Yahushua, he asked him, "Master, who is it?" And so why would this particular disciple be leaning against the breast of, why would he be right next to the Master? And we've already described the reasons why. Because Yahushua loved him. And he was more attached than ever to Yahushua because of his own resurrection. He was dead, and now he was raised. And he wanted to honor that one who raised him, and so he was close to him. He had that, if you want to call it, the phileo love. He loved him emotionally, but now also he loved him with the intellect. And so he was the one that was leaning against Yahushua, not John. John was a son of thunder. He was a son of thunder, not probably known as an emotional, warm, fuzzy kind of loving person. He was he wanted to bring down fire. But here's a man who had real reason to love with all of his heart and emotion the Master, and so he leaned up against his breast. By the designation of the other disciple, he stood nearby Yahushua at his trial. Okay, I guess we're going to look at that. Shimon Kepha and another disciple were following Yahushua. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Yahushua into the high priest's courtyard. So this is another disciple, or the other disciple in the next verse I haven't read yet. Why was he known to the high priest? Again, because
He's rich.
Yeah, because he's rich, because he's part of the high priestly family. He had the name of a high priest. All those Jews that came to the funeral. Why did all those Jews come? Because they knew Lazarus. He was one of them. And so this is why this disciple, Lazarus, was known to the high priest. Then there's the testimony of the other disciple, the one whom Yahushua loved, outrunning Kepha. It says that when he reached the tomb first, he looked in and waited. And then it says that Peter went in, but that this other disciple saw and believed. And so why would this disciple believe when he saw the grave clothes of the master in the tomb?
Because it happened.
Because it happened to him. Because the master raised him and they stripped off his grave clothes. And now he sees this testimony in the grave of the grave clothes lying all by themselves and the master's not there anymore. And so he saw and believed because he was a recipient of that resurrection power. And now he saw evidence of the resurrection of the Messiah, and so he believed. Even though the master had to scold all the 11 disciples for not believing. He was the one, Lazarus was the one who saw and believed. Kepha turned and saw the disciple whom Yahushua loved. This is another event in chapter 21. And this was the one who had leaned back against Yahushua at the supper and had said, "Master, who is going to betray you?" When Kepha saw him, he asked, "Master, what about him?" So Yahushua had told Kepha what his future looked like, that he was going to go somewhere where he didn't want to be. And then it was interpreted as he was going to be chained, that he was going to suffer on behalf of his testimony. And so Kepha, when he got the word for himself, he said, "Well, what about him?" And then the master said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." And because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Yahushua did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" So here's the question. Why did all the disciples think that this one wasn't going to die?
Because he already died.
Yeah.
Resurrected.
He already died and was resurrected. And so they interpreted the master's words as, okay, this one's not going to die. And so that's what they thought. That's how they interpreted the master's words. And yet the writer points out that that's not really what he said, okay? But if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? And this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. So here the record is complete, and every account of that other disciple, or the disciple whom Yahushua loved, fits in with the identification, the obvious identification of Lazarus, who was the writer of the fourth gospel. Okay, we already looked at that. So, the conclusion, my concluding statement. Why was the author of the fourth gospel trying to hide his identity? He wasn't trying to hide his identity. It's just that we haven't picked up on it because we've been lost in our tradition. We never even thought to ask the question, who is this disciple that Yahushua loved? Somebody told us it was John, and so we believed that John wrote the gospel. We had no reason to even investigate, even though when we do investigate, it's so evident and so clear that Lazarus was that disciple being named. How could millions of sincere believers for some 1900 years have been deceived about the identity of the writer of the fourth gospel? What does this say about the power of tradition? And what does this say about the reliability of tradition? It's because of the tradition. This is the problem with tradition. And we talk about this a lot. The traditions of men and the teachings of men in opposition with what the Word reveals and how Father wants us to know Him and worship Him and what it is He wants us to know about Him. Tradition, not invariably, but very often leads us in a different direction, away from, in this case, away from actually investigating and finding out for ourselves who wrote this fourth gospel. But it can lead us into other paths and other ways that are contrary to the Word. And so that's my concluding statement, is that once again, tradition is demonstrated to be unreliable We should not put our hope in tradition. We should not even practice. There are some traditions that are okay, but let's not get caught up in elevating tradition in the way that we worship him, the traditions we keep, without first investigating what does he say, what does the word say. Because the word, in this case, leads us in a to a different conclusion about who wrote the fourth gospel. Is it a salvation issue that we know who wrote the fourth gospel? I don't think so. But it's an important statement about tradition versus the word of Elohim. And we can see that the whole narrative changes when we understand who really wrote this gospel. It changes dramatically. And we can understand why these things occurred. You know, why these different events took place and the things that were said. Because it was Lazarus who the master loved and who wrote this book. That's all I got. What say you? I know for me this was an exciting teaching, and I've been waiting a long time to bring it. Not because it's a salvation issue, but because it has so much to say to us about how we need to apply ourselves to the Word and investigate the Word and find out what it says and not put any reliance on tradition. Go ahead.